This is Zach. Has anyone read the internet about Zach or anything like that? He is formerly known as Zangief of the USSR. Anyone familiar with his work in video game acting? He was a bear wrestler in the 90s, and his video game acting career kind of went to hell towards the end of the decade. They made too many sequels, is what happened. So Zangief took up coding and moved out of the USSR. He slimmed down a little bit. He writes code now, primarily Ruby, and he actually is going to talk to us about mRuby, which is fascinating and something that he works on rather a lot. So if you have questions about mRuby or Ruby in general, this is one of the people who writes Ruby and mRuby, so you should come and talk to him. His real name is Zach. You can call him Zangief if you want.
Thank you. Okay, all right, let's do this. Good morning. Hello, everybody. I have 35 minutes and 264 slides, so bear with me. Not kidding. We'll get through it, I promise. We will. As Joan mentioned, I am Zach, or Z-Zach on the internet. I live in San Francisco, where we are #1 in first world problems. I work at a company called Shutterfly, and I'm their senior archaeologist, where I'm paid to work on legacy code. And they also pay me to work on open source, so I'm a Ruby core member, contributor to Ruby, Sinatra maintainer, and I'm contributing to Rails. Someone once said that this is the trifecta, but I like to think of it as the triforce. I can't be here without thanking the organizers for getting me here, and Josh for having me. It's really great to be here at my first Ruby on Rails conference, so I know some of you are a repeat. That's awesome. This is my first one. I'm excited to be here. I think they invited me for a reason. I don't know who this guy is, but he's Irish, so I trust him. I flew down here, actually. I flew from San Francisco to Redmond Airport, which is, initials are RDM, and I couldn't help but wonder, maybe I'm the only person, like, where are all the red mages? No? No? Just me? Come on. So what are we going to talk about today? I was looking on the site, and I couldn't help but notice I don't really have a title. I'm not good at coming up with titles. So TBA, actually, it's to be announced because I have a huge announcement I'd like to share with you guys. Oh my God, Sinatra 2. It's gonna, nah, I'm just kidding. We're not gonna do that. You could also say to be awesome. Step 1, lab coats. Not kidding. I'm going to show you all how to be awesome. This is step 1. You need a lab coat. Josh actually asked me to bring this. It even says my name on it, which is great. Next thing, go first. I'm just warning you, it's all downhill from here, folks. And I'm mostly just trolling, but third step, blow people's minds. No, I'm still just trolling. I want to talk about Ruby everywhere today, and mostly using mRuby to do that, or as I like to call it, Ruby. We're going to talk about packaging Ruby. We're going to look at the landscape for packaging and what's available. We're going to look at how mRuby works, and we're going to build it and go through the process. And I'll show you how something I built in mRuby to help better understand. And we're going to look at some of the caveats involved or possibilities with mRuby and what's involved. Honestly, coming up with that, that's what I want to talk about, but naming is really hard, and I couldn't come up with the title. I also noticed that Ryan's title is Standing on the Shoulders of Giants, which is kind of funny because last year at Australia, I used that same title. Actually not knowing the year before Corey Haines' keynote had the same exact title. So anyways, I was thinking, I couldn't come up with a title, and the first thing I thought of was Wolfpack. I don't know why, and then I was like, do you guys remember these people? No? It was like, Wolfpack, World Wrestling Federation. And then I thought of Dances of Wolves and Kevin Costner. I was actually going to use that as a title, but I think it would just blow over people's heads. So landscape, what we're going to look at, what's available out there today. And in order to get into that, I want to kind of just briefly touch on what the subject matter is. And packaging, if we talk about, shipping code, I like to think of it as the ship. We already know Ruby Gems, Bundler, and Heroku. These are just facilities to move code and load it for us, right? So packaging is a way to do this for us. And usually what we need is our code, an environment, an interpreter to run our code, and some kind of interface. And usually our code is written in Ruby, and the main reason why I want to focus on this is because I really want to just write Ruby. I don't want to write JavaScript or Go or anything that's people are using these days for packaging. I just want to focus on writing Ruby. I really love the language. Typically, we work on Linux or OS 10. Really depends on the interface and what we're going for. I will briefly talk about Windows support, but that is another 260 slide deck that I did not create. When we talk about the interface, really what we're asking is what is our target and who consumes it. So in most cases, in the two cases I'm going to focus on here is like the command line interface and embedding. And so when we talk about command line interface, we want to target an end user's computer. And in some cases, we don't have an interpreter available. So we have to choose between mruby or JRI. If you're going to use JRuby for a command line interface, you're going to have to worry about the startup time. And I don't really want to throw anyone to the wolves. Shoes RB actually solves this problem really well. It's the first one that I ever ran into. And it does some really cool things. It has some great ideas. Like you can create installer packages for Linux, OS 10, and Windows. And it does this by compiling Shoes and Ruby into libraries that you can link dynamically. And it can also include dynamic libraries for SQLite and links against them. When it creates the archive, it uses a pure Ruby implementation of tar, and it archives the whole package and then uses bin inject to create an exe or damage for OS 10, or for Linux, I think it creates a shell script or something. I think there was people working on Debian and stuff. But that's just basically the installer. And then would go ahead, and build Ruby with Shoes and everything. This has some downsides to it, mostly because it was like anything built by Y, it was a wolf in sheep's clothing. There's some libraries that we can use to do this as well. If you look on the Ruby toolbox, there is only 4 listed. And like the top one is building Windows executables. So that doesn't really help you if you want to build executables for other environments, right? And the problem with these is that they build the interpreter like Shoes does. And so this often breaks during upgrades, and you'll get locked into a version because configuration definitely varies a lot. And you're talking about Windows support, which is, minimal at best in some cases. But I think it's getting better. There's a project called Traveling Ruby that works for Windows, Linux, and OS 10. It's kind of like the way Shoes handles it, except it uses pre-built binaries and includes the interpreter for you and some other common libraries. And then you have to write your Ruby code, and it just packages it with the binary. I say good luck with other dependencies because if you have a C extension or something, it's up to you to figure out how to compile that for your target if it's Windows or something. You're going to have to worry about that. And for Windows, they just added a spike which basically just used the Ruby installer in binary and embedded that. I really wanted to try Traveling Ruby. It looks really cool, but I didn't get very far. And I don't want to be one to cry wolf. But It's a pretty cool project. You should definitely check it out. When we talked about CLI, so embedding, usually that means the end user's phone. And one such example you can do this with is Ruby Motion, which lets you write cross-platform native apps in Ruby. This has some cool features. It's statically compiled ahead of time, so it compiles your code into native machine code, so that it's way more efficient that way. And it's cross-platform. However, there's some issues, basically because there's separate interpreters for Android and OS X, and the implementation is not open. Which, if you're not familiar with the project, it's a commercial project, and there's a fee you have to pay yearly to use it. But they handle, it is good because they handle App Store and stuff for you, whereas you have to do that on your own normally. I talked to Loren about this when I was in Belgium recently, and he's like, the number one complaint is people don't know why they have to pay. And my answer to that question is, Ruby is dead, it doesn't matter, don't buy dead things. So, mRuby, how does this solve this? How is it different? We're going to look at that. And if you're not familiar with mRuby, it's a subset of the Ruby language. It's designed to be embedded. Matt's wrote it and still maintains it today. And last stable release was in November. If we look at actually building mRuby, we have an existing version of Ruby. I'm using trunk, and just clone the repo from Git. Which takes a few seconds, and then we change directories in there and then compile it, and you'll see how fast this actually is to compile the language. I don't know if you've compiled Ruby or JRuby or something. It takes quite a while. This is literally like 10 to 15 seconds, and it's done right there. So just to reiterate, we have an existing Ruby, we cloned it, and then we ran rake, and that's all you have to do to build the interpreter. And if we look at the summary, it gives us all these included gems come with mRuby now. They're not part of the core, but it's essentially a standard library. Two of the main ones that we can use right off the bat is MIRB and the mRuby binary itself. So I'll show you a quick demo of that using the build where it compiles to the host target is one of the targets, and we can see the version there. And if we use MIRB, we get a interpreter or a REPL. So within 30 seconds, you can have an interactive Ruby interpreter with all of the core features of Ruby compiled statically. And to better understand this, I want to look at the build process and what it does. Essentially what it does is it compiles all the sources that mRuby links to, and then does some code generation because it compiles the bytecode, and then packages it for us. You saw in the binary there, this is just a package. This binary that gets spit out, this is all of your code compiled statically. I'll get into that in a little more detail in a second. But if we look at the rake file, how mRuby does this, there's two tasks. I'll talk about this one in a second, but the build one, the first thing it does is it links to all the dep files, and these are just file tasks. We'll go through it real quick. Basically what it does is it goes through all the binaries for your target and links them so that they can be used later as the install path for a dependency through rake. And then from there it goes through each target of each gem you depend on in each binary, and then it uses the linker and it links them to libmruby, and then creates a dependency on libmruby itself so that I can compile all of them into that file. So when we run our tests, I was going to show a demo, but it's actually too quick. It takes like 0.17 seconds to run the test, so there's no point in using a video. It's very fast. This is actually the two hosts I was talking about. So we have host debug and test host. This is just the default build configuration setup of mRuby. You can specify any number of targets. I'll kind of show you that later. But the test process, basically, it's kind of convoluted, but it concatenates all of the tests that you specify, compiles them into bytecode, and then compiles the bytecode for running the test, and including all the licenses that you depend on, and then executes this test binary for each of your target. And we can understand this if we look at the rake file in mRB test, which when we go back here, we depend on all, which was all these dep files, but it also does some more work here. It creates all of our targets, and it goes through and grabs all the test files and links them to this mRB test dependency. And mRB test is just an executable. We'll look into that. But for each target, it goes through and sets up the gem so that they're configured and the flags are passed through, and then it goes through and links to this gem init file, which is generated for us at compile time. And basically what this does is it takes a cert library, which is just a Ruby library, a very trimmed down like mini test unit. My favorite method in here is assert, which is kind of like power assert, if any of you have heard of that gem. You just basically use assert with a block, and it just evaluates the code and pass-fail, basically. It has support for ISO standard specification built in for mRB. I don't really use that personally, but I think they care about that in some manner. What it does here then is it takes that Ruby file and compiles it to bytecode, and then links it towards this function call. And basically where this function gets embedded when we read out the init file, when creating, like this is the file task to create the test executable. And so we read in that init file that we generated, and from there we basically ends up looking like this, where we take the assert, the internal representation of the bytecode for the assert library, and then load it here. And it basically turns into like 630 lines of bytecode. Like I just folded this up. And then from there it loads the actual tests, which turn into about 13,000 lines of bytecode on mRuby itself, like including all of the libraries. And then if you have gems enabled and you're linking to gems, it'll run all of their tests. And basically, when it's generating this function for each gem, it creates a new function here to init, and then generates a function call for each gem that you link to. And it basically, for the default standard library, looks like this. So it's just one function called, very straightforward, and then it builds, right? If we look at actually the output of the compiler, it helps us quite a bit understand. Here we can see where it's compiling. These are mRBC is this bytecode calls for all the test files that mRuby links to. And then starts here, it goes through mRB test, compiled executable, and then we can see where it moves on to assert, compiles it to bytecode, compiles that C file, and then links it, and then it continues to go through each of these standard library gems that we link to, or any gems really. It doesn't have to be standard library. This is sprintf. This is the first one it goes to. I'm not sure on the order or anything, but that's what basically it goes on to. Compiles that to gem test, and then these gem test files are linked. And then it executes. And it takes about 0.18 seconds. This is literally just an executable, a binary per se, that we could take and run it again whenever, basically. And it just has all of our code linked statically, all of the tests included, right? So it packages all that into a test. And this is something that mRuby can do, and I think it's brilliant, and I think it's really great that we have this ability in Ruby. We haven't had before. And how many of you are still with me? All right, good. For a better understanding, I think it'll help if we build something-ish. And so I want to introduce my little library that I built. It's called mRuby Static, and it's inspired by Jekyll, and I just wanted a way to write Markdown and preview it in a page. And so I used mRuby to do this. I thought it was pertinent when someone tweeted this. They said Jekyll has too many dependencies, one of them being Nokogiri. It takes forever to compile. If any of you have ever compiled a huge Jekyll site like rubylang.org, it takes like 13 to 15 minutes. It's like, why does it's just JavaScript and HTML? I don't understand. So I gave up and built this. And I have some to-dos. If you're interested, come talk to me. Like, we can hack on it. I'm going to show you, walk through the code right now. But if I demo it, I can show you basically, like, I have a site. It just has a site RB file. Source has the static CSS file. And I have the binary static that I generated. I'll show you exactly how I created the binary. But basically, we can create a new post and pass in a string as a title, and it just creates a file for us. And if I open that up, we see my contents here. So it's just a starting point for anything like you do with Jekyll, basically, right? But there's no metadata, because why do I need metadata? I don't know. So if we want to preview this page, we can run preview run, and then just copy this URL, copy that URL, and then open our browser, paste, and we get a 404. Oh, because I didn't type the name in. I don't remember what I recorded. All right, your content here, okay. All right, and then I proceeded to take the README from the file, because it's just a markdown file, right? And you saw it on the GitHub page when I briefly showed that. And just move that content over and then run the preview again. Restart the server. Because things are cached, I'll show you in a second. But then we can see this is the README rendered using my markdown engine that I'm using. So very straightforward. Makes it super easy. I just wanted to get up and running with something so I could show you guys. It also has the ability to output all of these files to a folder such you can do with Jekyll so that you can deploy it someplace. And so in this case, I just did generate site, and you can see the HTML file. This isn't just rendering the markdown live. It's the compiled version. And all this is made possible by this library that I wrote, and starts off at the entry point here where we configure the static site generator, and then we just call start. It's like any other typical CLI interface we would write. Configuration probably looks familiar if most of you are writing Rails or Ruby. It's just a class, and we can yield to instance eval basically anything we pass in, so that these options get overridden, right? And there's some defaults there that I don't want to reproduce. And then from here we go into when we call start, I think it's start here. It calls parse command, and then it just takes the arguments from the command line and then runs a very, very simple regular expression on that, and then turns that into a class, and then sends the action. Nothing, what could go wrong, right? If you do happen to get an argument error, I catch it and call help, which is here. It's just a very basic thing. Every CLI app should probably have this, right? So when we intern this into a class and call the action, it's just another class. For example, post new, it's just a class with a method new on it. I'm not using any method missing magic or anything. If it's not there, it doesn't exist, and you're probably typing the wrong command. That's your own fucking problem. We'll look at document. Because this part here is rendering the template, the important thing for generating a file is here, where we just basically grab the file name, gsub it, and then write to this path in Markdown. The body itself is not parsed at all. It's just whatever is given to it, so whatever string you give the body. The template itself is actually using discount. I'll talk briefly about that. It's another MRB gem that wraps the discount C library, which is a Markdown implementation in C. And so I've linked against this library, and there's a MRB gem to do that. And I'm just rendering in a block here. This is probably not the most beautiful Ruby code, but it does the trick. This preview thing uses simple HTTP server and builds my routes for me using the static site. And you can see here where I call site routes. These are just cached, and the documents are just cached. We call to.html on the document. It's just an instance of document, very straightforward. We can see the routes here where it just goes into uses dir, which isn't actually core part of MRB. I've used another library here. And select the files, only the ones that are marked down, and then we actually parse them and cache those into some hash. And so generating the site is really easy because we can just iterate over these hashes that are cached. And this is the reason why I had to restart the server, because I just cached these things on start, the first time you call those methods, because I just wanted it to be faster if I had a lot of pages, which I didn't, and so it doesn't matter. I definitely prematurely optimized. Please forgive me, I'm sorry. Anyways, moving right on. The gems that I linked to, I showed you dir.io and pack. So when we create a build, we want to link to these gems, and we can just link to a GitHub location or a repo. I know Go kind of does something like this in that you can just give like a source location, it'll statically link that for you. MRuby will do this as well as long as you're using config gem. I showed you how it grabs all the gems you link against. And then here we just link to my gem that I created. And so this file is just any other gem specification in Ruby. We add our dependencies for runtime, and then you might have noticed why there isn't like exactly one-to-one. It's because some of these also add dependencies to the runtime for me. And I'm not sure exactly which ones. It's kind of like a dependency graph hell, but it's all statically linked, so YOLO, whatever. The rake file I'm using to build MRuby is super important. I've passed in the MRuby configuration after I've downloaded the archive and expanded it, and then when I use rake, I'm specifying my build configuration to MRuby, to not use the default one that I showed you, to use the one that I just wrote. And then we can run the tests. We've always passed in MRuby config so that it knows to use this file for me. And I can specify other targets. But basically, in other cases, when we get to this point, one example we can look at for that is the regular expression library that I'm using, which is Oniguruma. And it's basically like the regular expression engine that we have in Ruby, but it's just linking against Oniguruma. So I use it here in my library. As I showed you, there's literally one regular expression. And so their specification adds the library to the linker, but you also need to tell it how to get that library. So in your specification, they're using a version and they're telling it, this is where the header file is, and then it continues to make a file dependency on this header file. And we can see here where it extracts the archive for that library. It's literally on GeoCities. Probably skills, I don't have any idea. And then extracts it for me. But after we get that, then we need to compile it so that we can link against that header. And so we have the header dependency, and then we have the library dependency. And what it does is passes these build commands along and then runs auto tools and configures and makes. And then it links that library out to the CC and the linker for include pass and library pass. I added support to the discount library so that I could statically link discount, the C library, to the gem, because I was running into portability issues when I wanted to deploy this thing and run it on Travis or something. I need to also install the header files on that system. So to get around that, we should statically link our dependencies and avoid dynamic links when possible. It's not a part of the MRuby way. And this patch is very straightforward. I started by using Open3 because we're just running straight Ruby. We're not using MRuby to build this stuff, so we can use other gems like Open3, and we can run commands through that. And so one such command that I did was configure and make. And then I also have the clone command for getting the source. And so I do that there, and then I just link against the discount dir file so that the library path the include can find that. Basically, there's no require. The include is your require. So you need to tell the compiler where to look, right? It's just like load path in Ruby, and include is your basically your require at that point. We can do cross-compilation. Basically, we're just specifying different targets, and we can override flags and compilers. This is from the wiki. I actually did this using AppFair, which is a Windows CI environment, and I installed MinGW so that I could cross-build binaries. You could do this on Linux as well, and basically you just specify a build config file and just override the linker commands. So I can override the binary that comes out, which is to be an exe, and I can do the executable as exe, and I can use MinGW, the GCC port, and the archiver for those commands, which will just override whatever MRuby does. We can see here in the Oniguruma library that you're using this when passing along, so that you have to keep that chain going, and this is the most difficult part of this process, is making sure you're linking things properly and passing on the right environment variables. You can override a bunch of stuff. This is all on the wiki, the linker as well. There's a bunch of stuff you're going to have to get into. But all of this really reminds me that this is all built on top of Rake, literally, and Jim is amazing, and I miss him. And so thank you, Jim. There are some caveats involved in this. I'll just go briefly over this stuff. Compiling requires Ruby, I showed you. Packaging, you should worry about what you're doing with your bytecode. It should be a part of your compile process and linking in the interpreter so that everything is statically linked. And dependencies are unbounded. Like I said, if a dependency requires another library that I don't necessarily know, I'm not going to find out until I compile it. The VM introduces some overhead. We're going to go into these topics real quick. There's no global interpreter lock, and it uses a registry VM architecture, so there's some trade-offs involved in that. When I talk about overhead, what I mean is there's costs for VMs, and it's recommended to run one VM per thread because starting many instances at once is really slow. And this reason why there's no global interpreter lock is because there's no mutual exclusion because the VM is thread unsafe. And thread safety introduces even more overhead, so they want to limit that even more. And the key to this is to use multiple VMs. This to solve this problem. And it's possible by the registry VM architecture, which in theory allows you to have infinite registers or instances, providing there's enough room, right? So if you want to run a VM per thread, if your OS only gives you 2 threads, well, guess what? You only get 2 VMs. I said there's no require, there's also no eval, and if you're going to do block invocation like I was doing in the configuration setup, you should do that in Ruby and not in C. And the garbage collector requires write barriers everywhere so that it can be more efficient. There's some other really weird quirks, like you can only have 1024 local variables in any given method, and string literals are limited to 1024 bytes. This is just for like optimizations for the VM so that it can be built on smaller things. Lua has similar quirks. The adoption rate is pretty bearing. I mean, I haven't seen many people talk about it outside of Japan, and searching for mruby docs is really hard. I actually had the pleasure of talking to Mats before I gave this talk and just asked him a ton of questions. Not everyone can do that. Not everyone has access to Mats like that. So it's super important that we try to fix this. The target audience is embedding. I know a lot of people are concerned that if that's the only use case, that it's not good for other things, but I think that's not the case. If you look at what other people are doing with Nginx, they're embedding mruby into this web server that's HTTP2 compliant, and it's called Trusted, and people are actually using this in production. It's using a HTTP2 module for mruby that links against NG-HTTP2, which is a C library for this implementation. I also have a really quick introduction to embedding into iOS. If we have time, I can get through this. I just said hello world Ruby on Rails, and I created like a very simple iOS app to do this. I cheated. I used the CocoaPod, which builds mruby for me using the SDK, and then I have a view controller that outlets to this action and embeds mruby inside of it. So when I'm clicking this button, I'm linking it to say hello. And what say hello does is actually boots up the Ruby interpreter and then generates a method for me. And using the text, it converts that. So it takes the text out of iOS, converts it to C, then sends it to mruby, converts that to an MRB value, and then converts it back to C, back to iOS, and then says hello. Like, this method is very straightforward. It just takes a C string and then basically does the same thing for us, like MRB value, Ruby string from C string, right? And then just concatenates them using MRB and returns that so we can get that value back. Got it. All right. So there's some other cool things that people are doing. Sid Meier's Civ 5, they used it. People are working on a just-in-time compiler, which is really cool. Mats wants to focus on this, improving VM speed, refactoring instance restructure, improve hash table performance. That's all the time I have. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your conference.